Hello, Happy New Year, and welcome to Season 2 of the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. I'm Dr Nerida, horse owner, horse lover, and professional equine nutritionist, and I'm so excited to kick off Season 2 by re-sharing our most listened to episode from Season 1. This is Season 1, Episode 1, Feed Your Horse Like a Horse, where we zoom right out to look at your horse's 55 million year evolution, then zoom right back into practical modern day feeding. We'll talk forage, fibre variety, and why your horse's stomach has no off switch for acid production, and why this puts them at constant risk of disease. Plus, we'll look at how simple management choices can reduce risk of issues like ulcers and colic. If you're new here, this is the perfect place to start. And if you've been here since the beginning, consider this a recap of the most important concepts in equine nutrition and your roadmap to keeping feeding simple. You ready? Let's get into it. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do for the first episode, and I landed on why don't we talk about feeding your horse like a horse, which what do I mean by that? So horses have been on this earth for a very long period of time. So 55 million years they have been evolving. They started out as this funny little creature called the Eohippus. So it was a dog-sized toad creature. And over the last 55 million years, which if you stop and try to think about that timescale is a very long time, they've been evolving into what we now know as the modern day horse. And I like to think about feeding our horses and always starting at the point of, well, how did they evolve? What did they evolve to eat? Because when you look at the fact that their gastrointestinal tract and their body has been developing for 55 million years, a very, very long time, you start to understand that the way they're built and the way they need to eat is very specific. And it's been, I guess, molded in them over such a long period of time that we need to really honour that evolution of their nutritional needs and of the way that they need to be provided nutrition, because it's been with them for such a long time. And I guess to give it some perspective, we need to think about how long the horse has been domesticated. So they've been on Earth for 55 million years, but they've really only been in close association with humans for less than 5,000 years. So there was a paper only published last year. It was a massive study that went back and had a look at a whole lot of data and science to find that in actual fact, we now think that horses have only been properly domesticated to the point where they were truly involved in horse-based mobility. So where humans were riding horses and using horses for transport for about 4,200 years. So if you think about that timescale, a horse has been evolving for 55 million years, and they've been closely associated with humans for 4,200 years. And to put that into perspective, if we created a timescale of 55 million years that was 10 kilometres long, so for those of you who don't speak in kilometres, you'll have to get your calculators out and do the conversions. But if we made the timescale 10 kilometres long, so 10,000 metres, being the scale of 55 million years, the 4,200 years that a horse has been closely associated with humans is the last 76 centimetres of that 10 kilometres. So it's not even a step. So if you think about if a very average sized human step being about a metre, depending on how tall you are, but my steps are about right on a metre, I would have to take 10,000 steps to walk 10 kilometres, and that would signify 55 million years. But the amount of time that the horse has been domesticated is less than one of my steps. So it's a tiny, tiny amount of time, which means that we are working with an animal and feeding an animal that has very, very specific needs. And if we don't honour those needs, or we try to change the way that we feed them too much, then we start to cause a lot of issues. So we all know and fear as horse owners colic. So colic is a classic example of one of the issues that starts to occur when we don't honour a horse's gastrointestinal tract and feed a horse like a horse. So if we don't feed a horse the way that a horse has evolved to feed, then we start to run into issues. It's not difficult to feed a horse like a horse. And when you understand a little bit of their gastrointestinal physiology and a little bit about, the way they did evolve and what they evolved eating and why we need to feed them the way we need to feed them, it actually becomes quite simple to understand how to feed a horse like a horse. And what I want to do in this podcast is to go through the top 5 things you need to do to feed your horse like a horse. So the first one is to base your horse's diet on forage. So I'm sure this is one that if you have owned a horse for any amount of time, you will have come across, is that diet should be forage based. And this all comes back to the fact that little Eohippus 55 million years ago, the little dog-sized toad creature, typically lived on berries and fruits and higher energy browse, I guess. It was a little forest dweller. But then as competition increased in the forests, our little forest dweller got pushed out onto the grasslands. And on the grasslands, the horse evolved over many millions of years into a much larger animal that became a grazer predominantly. So they predominantly ate by grazing, so head down on the ground and eating grasses and shrubs and forbs and things like that, as opposed to being more of a browser like its much older ancestor was. So these horses have evolved on these very high forage diets. And because the forage that they were forced to eat essentially when they got pushed out onto the rangelands was much lower in energy and it took them quite a long time to eat it, they have become animals that their gastrointestinal tract is completely set up around constantly eating. So studies show us that horses will eat for 17 or 18 hours of the day. And yes, they'll stop eating for periods of time and they'll go and have short rests for periods of the time, but they'll never, if left to their own devices, they won't have long periods of time where they're not eating, because their whole gastrointestinal system is designed around eating large amounts of lower quality, high fibre forages over long periods of the day. So when we feed our domestic horses, that's what we need to be trying to replicate, is to be keeping forage in front of them all the time and allowing them to eat forage for long periods of every day. So, if you can have forage constantly available, so for example, if you can have horses out grazing on pasture, that's perfect. If you aren't fortunate enough to have pasture, or if there's not enough pasture for them to eat and get a decent amount of forage each day, then we typically will provide hay or haylage depending on where you are in the world. Haylage can be quite common in some parts of the world. So keeping that forage in front of your horse and basing the diet on forage, so having a majority of the food that they're eating every day being forage. So a diet centered around forage keeps your horse's gut really healthy, and it keeps your horse's gut microbes really healthy. So this is the first time in this podcast series that I have mentioned microbes, and you are going to hear them mentioned many, many times because they are so important. And in fact, when horses got pushed from the forests out onto the rangelands, they essentially had to figure out how am I going to digest this high fibre diet now? Because horses, like most animals, humans included, don't have the enzymes necessary in their gut to actually digest fibre. So they essentially had to have a conversation with a whole lot of microbes to say, hey, if we give you somewhere warm and safe to live and a constant supply of high fibre food, will you share with us the energy from that fibre? And the microbes happily agreed and took up residence in the horse's gut. So your horse has trillions and trillions of microbes living in their gut. And it's actually those microbes that do the job of digesting forage, so the fibre in forages like hays and pastures, and they give to the horse the energy that they don't need out of those forages. So they break it down in a process called fermentation, and they give the horse essentially the byproducts of fermentation, which is the leftover energy that they don't want or need. So when we enter a diet around forage, it keeps the gut healthy and it keeps the resident microbes really happy and healthy as well. And that has lots and lots of positive flow-on effects. So this is how we create nice calm behaviour. It's how we prevent lots of diseases like colic and gastric ulcers, which I'll talk more about in a little bit. And it keeps our horses mentally happy and healthy as well, because they're so wired to chew. So they've evolved like 55 million years. I know I keep saying it, but it's a long time. And you can guarantee that the behavioural patterns that have been wired into horses over that period of time are really hardwired. So your horses, doesn't matter what breed, doesn't matter what their occupation, they are wired to chew on forage. And if you can keep them on a diet that's based on forage, it is going to mean that they are so happy mentally. And in fact, one of my favourite things to do is go and sit with my horses when they've got some hay and just sit beside them and watch. And there's two things that I love to see. It is the droopiness that they get in their eyes. So they go almost into this like a meditative, almost sort of hypnotic state when they're chewing. And then the second thing I love to see is the saliva that drools down their lips, because I know that saliva is so important for keeping the gastrointestinal tract healthy. And I'll talk more about that in a couple of minutes too. But as a guideline for how much forage you want your horse on, you should aim for at least 2% of your horse's body weight in forage each day. So that's 2 kilos for every 100 kilograms of your horse's body weight. So if you've got, say, an average size 500 kilogram horse, which is what we talk about as an average size horse, then that's 10 kilos of forage per day. So that's either, allowing them free access to grazing, or if you're feeding them hay, 10 kilos is, depending on how big the bales are that you're using, but if you've got a standard 2-string, what we call square, but it's actually a rectangle bale, that it's around half to just under half of one of those small bales of hay. So it's a lot of forage each day if you're hand feeding. And I think a trap that some people can fall into is just not realizing how much forage a horse needs and underfeeding the forage. So if you are feeding just hay, next time you're at the barn or down at the paddock or wherever your horse lives, grab a hay bag and a set of luggage scales and just weigh how much hay you feed each day, just to check and see, because it is really, really important that your horse gets enough forage, and you should be aiming for about 2% of your horse's body weight. It will vary, and we'll talk a lot more about, how much forage do horses like racehorses need, or how low can you go if horses need to lose weight. But as a rule for a majority of horses, that 2% of their body weight in forage, or 2 kilos per 100 kilos body weight, is a good place to aim for. So the second rule in feeding your horse like a horse is to provide a variety of forage and fibre. So the basis for this is that when our little friend Eohippus wandered out of the forests and evolved into our beautiful modern day horse, they grazed over such a massive land area. There was no fences keeping them in. There was no owners to say that they needed to stay in a certain spot. They were free to roam, and in roaming, they were able to select from a big variety of plant species. So back when they were evolving, no modern agriculture, and they really could choose from a massive variety of plants. So if we look at, I guess, what would be considered a modern-day wild horse, there's studies to show that they'll eat 40 to 50 plant species over a 12-month period. And what that gives them is a number of things. So the first is that it gives them a variety in nutrients. Every plant species that a horse eats is going to have a slightly different combination of nutrients. So if you think about protein, for example, protein is made up of 20 different amino acids. The number varies sometimes, but we'll say 20 for today. So the amino acids are like the building blocks of protein, and every protein is different. So if we talk about some ingredients that are familiar to us, so if we talk about, say, lucerne or alfalfa hay, depending on where you are in the world, so its amino acids in the protein that it contains are going to be different to the amino acids that you find in a ryegrass hay, which will be different to the amino acids you find in a timothy hay. You get, if you fed all three of those hays, you would get a lot of protein with very varying amino acid profiles. So you get this nutrient variety. There's also a variety in, there's so many nutrients. So I can never remember the names of them when I have to. But things like phytonutrients, for example, all these different little chemical compounds that individual plants contain that other plants may not contain. So if you've got a horse that can eat a big variety of plant material, it's going to have a lot of nutrient variety versus a horse that might be fed just a single type of hay and, say, one higher energy hard feed. So, for example, a horse that might be getting timothy hay or ryegrass hay as the only hay that it's fed, and then on a diet that is based on soybean hulls or based on wheat bran or meal run or meal mix, there's lots and lots of feeds that have got a dominance of one ingredient in them. So if you had a horse that was just on, was restricted down to 2 or 3 different plant ingredients, the nutrients that it's receiving actually become quite restricted. So having a variety of forages and fibres in the diet mean that you get a big nutrient variety, and that means that we've got a better chance of actually meeting your horse's entire nutrient requirements. So there's lots of nutrient requirements we understand, so for protein, some amino acids and vitamins and minerals. We understand those nutrient requirements quite well, but we don't understand the requirement for a lot of nutrients that are present in forages and fibres and other feedstuffs. We just don't understand what a horse's requirements for them might be, but we know that they're important in some way. And really the only way that we can make sure that we're meeting our horse's requirements for all those weird and wonderful nutrients is to make sure that they're getting as much variety in their diet as possible. And one way to do that is to make sure that you provide a variety of forage. We also, when we provide a variety of forage, we reduce toxicity issues. So if you're feeding a hay, for example, that has been baled with quite a high nitrate content or some other toxic compound that could be in there, and that's your horse's only forage, then they've got no way of really avoiding that toxic component. And also, too, it makes up such a big part of their diet that it will do more damage than if it only made up a small part of their diet. So, there's things, mycotoxins are another one, so different toxic components that can be lurking in our forages, that if your horse is solely reliant on one forage and that toxic component is in that forage, then it's going to have a much bigger impact on your horse than if you are feeding a variety of forages and each forage is only making up a small part of your horse's diet. Hi, it's Nerida, just jumping in for a sec. If you want clarity around your horse's diet without the stress or the scrolling, the My Happy Horse app is the fastest way to get it. A couple of taps and suddenly everything makes sense. Visit myhappy.horse or download it from the App Store. Okay, let's get back into the good stuff. And then the third and possibly the most important reason to have a variety of forage in the diet is that when you've got forage variety, you've also got fibre variety, and fibre variety creates microbe diversity in the gut. And we know now from lots of research that is being done, there's so much research in this area at the moment, but we know that if we can have microbe diversity in the gut, the microbes are much more resilient. So they're much less likely to be knocked into dysbiosis, so to become unbalanced and dominated by bad bacteria. We know that in horses specifically, horses that have got higher diversity of microbes in their gut are less prone to colic. And in the reverse, when you get low diversity, then you've got a higher risk of colic. We know that diversity is important for proper digestion and for immune function. It's important for so many reasons. So again, in honouring a horse's evolution and the fact that for so many years they wandered around without us restricting them and able to select a highly varied diet, if we can honour that by providing them a variety of forage or fibres, so we can bring in alternate fibres like beet pulp or lupin hulls or nicely processed and safe soybean hulls or copra meal. There's lots of different alternate fibres that we can bring in. When we can bring in lots of forage and fibre variety, we promote gut microbe diversity, and that's just so valuable to your horse. It is incredibly important, and it's one thing that I would really encourage you to think about when you're feeding your horses, is to go and find as many different forages and as much fibre variety, get as much fibre variety into your horse's diet as you can. So our third rule for feeding your horse like a horse is to ensure 24/7 access to forage. So as I've mentioned, horses are designed to graze almost constantly. And because they've grazed almost constantly for so many millions of years, their stomach, which is a single gastric stomach, so their stomach is very much like our human stomach in that it secretes gastric acid, but there's a big difference between a horse's stomach and a human stomach. And that is because horses are designed to eat constantly, they actually don't have an on-off switch for their gastric acid production. So our human stomachs produce gastric acid, but because we're meal feeders, so we eat in distinct meals, we also secrete acid only when we need it into our stomach. So when we smell food or think about eating food, start eating food or are eating food, our stomach starts to actively secrete hydrochloric acid. But then as soon as we stop eating, the acid production switches off. So we can go, for 8, 10, 12, 15, much longer periods of time, hours, without eating, and we don't end up with a pool of acid sitting in our stomach because we have an on-off switch for gastric acid production. But horses, because of the way they evolved and because they grazed almost constantly for so many millions of years, their stomach didn't see the need for an on-off switch for gastric acid because it essentially needed to be on all the time. And that's exactly what it is. It is just on all the time. So if you leave your horse without access to forage, your horse's stomach is secreting gastric acid. And after 4 to 6 hours, if they haven't been eating any forage, that acid is going to be accumulating in their stomach, and the pH can drop down to as low as a pH of 1. So anyone knows the pH scale, that's really, really low. And in fact, it's like, battery acid, the pH of battery acid. So it's highly corrosive. And if you Google liquids with a pH of 1, you'll see all sorts of warnings about them being corrosive and they must be handled with care. And yet if we leave our horse without access to forage, that's what accumulates in their stomach. And then what happens is the acid will also start to move around in the stomach because there's no longer a big mat of fibre or a mass of fibre in the horse's stomach to stop it from splashing around. Now, the stomach was smart enough, the horse's stomach was smart enough to realise that it was going to be secreting acid all the time, and so it creates a very thick and protective mucus layer down the bottom part of the stomach where the acid is normally sitting to stop the acid from eating through the horse's own stomach wall. But because they were able to graze almost constantly, their stomach was almost always constantly full of fibre. So the top part of the stomach didn't see the need to protect itself from gastric acid. And so it is completely unprotected. It is just skin. It's like the skin on the back of your hand. So you imagine if you dripped battery acid onto the back of your hand for a period of time, you would pretty soon create a sore or an open wound, which in a horse's stomach is what a gastric ulcer is. So a squamous gastric ulcer, so in the top part of the stomach that is unprotected from the acid, if your horse's stomach becomes empty and fills up with acid and then that acid moves and splashes around, it will literally just eat holes in the top part of your horse's stomach and cause gastric ulceration. So it's one of the most important parts of feeding your horse like a horse, and that is to ensure that your horse has got 24/7 access to forage so that they can control that. They can't control the acid production in their stomach, but they can control the pH of the acid in their stomach, and they can stop the acid from splashing around by having fibre in there all the time. So they can control the pH because when they chew on fibre, they produce a lot of saliva, and that saliva goes into the stomach and it buffers or dilutes the acid and keeps the pH up a lot higher, so usually above 4, to stop the acid from being so damaging and so easily burning holes through the top of your horse's stomach. So if you have got horses at pasture, that is ideal because then they can go and graze whenever they like to keep their stomach full of fibre and saliva. If you have your horse on hay, you'll find that horses can eat their entire daily allocation. So they can eat their 2% of body weight in hay in a very, very short space of time. So what you need to do is get quite creative in how you feed your horse their daily hay allocation. So if you need to slow your horse down because they eat their day's worth of hay too quickly, then you get creative and use some slow feeding hay bags, or there's some amazing slow feeding hay boxes on the market. Or if you have got large round bales or large square bales, then you can use big bale hay nets to slow down their intake so that they don't eat too much hay too quickly in an extensive amount of time, that they'll stand there and chew and salivate. But there's lots of ways to slow a horse's hay intake down, and it really is worth investing in some of the I guess I'm going to call it technology that you can use to slow intake down so that you can extend the amount of time your horse is eating forage for as long as possible. Because the longer you can keep them eating over a 24-hour period, the more comfortable their stomach is going to be and the lower the risk of gastric ulceration. And also, as we discussed before, the happier your horse will be because they're so wired to chew. If you're extending the amount of time it takes them to eat their daily forage allocation, then they're going to be much healthier and much happier horses. Now, our fourth rule in feeding your horse like a horse is to feed a balanced diet. Forage is crucial, but modern forages just don't provide all the horses that nutrients need. So forage is crucial, but modern forages don't provide all the nutrients that horses need. So we'll see in modern forages, so in almost every single one of the thousands now of forage analyses that I've seen in my career, usually you'll see copper and zinc being too low to meet requirements. Depending on where you are in the world, selenium and iodine are very frequently too low to meet requirements. And depending on the forage, the calcium, phosphorus, magnesium amounts and ratios also sometimes are not what your horse needs. So hay like alfalfa, lucerne is very high in calcium, but it can sometimes be very low in phosphorus and won't meet phosphorus requirement. Or a hay made from a really lush, rapidly growing grass forage will often actually be too high in phosphorus and not high enough in calcium. So it'll have an unbalanced calcium to phosphorus ratio in the opposite direction to what lucerne has. So we need to be aware that forage is so important, and it definitely should form the base of your horse's diet, and you definitely need to provide a variety of forage, which will also provide nutrient variety and have the forage available 24/7, but also be very aware that forage is not a complete diet for a horse because it is almost certainly going to be nutrients missing. And depending on what your horse is doing, you may also need to top up the energy amount in their diet, or the calories that they're receiving, and also protein. So for a lactating mare, for example, a mare with a foal at foot, it's very hard to provide enough energy and protein to her just in forage. So high quality forages will almost meet her requirements, and very highly improved pastures will be able to meet energy and protein requirements of lactating mares. But for mares on lower quality forages, you typically will need to add some higher energy ingredients to balance the diet. And higher protein ingredients to make sure that she's getting her protein requirements met as well. So just depending on what the horse needs, you might need to add a vitamin and mineral supplement just to top up some of those minerals that are missing. Or for horses, say on dried pastures or drought-affected pastures, or horses that are being fed hay, and particularly hay that's older than 6 months old, there will be vitamin deficiencies starting to appear in the diet too. So particularly vitamin A and vitamin E, which do not like being baled into hay and typically won't hang around very long in hay. So horses that are on hay-based diets, particularly last season's hay, will need some sort of vitamin supplementation because they will become vitamin deficient when they're eating hay, or if they're eating dried, browned off pastures. So you may only need a vitamin mineral supplement, or you might like to use a balancer pellet. And then where you need to add extra energy and protein, there's a plethora of fortified feeds on the market. You may have one of those that you like to use, or you can add high quality straights like your sugar beet pulps or stabilized rice bran or oats or soybean. There's any number of beautiful ingredients, and one podcast I will do is my top 10 favourite ingredients, so keep an eye out for that one. But there's lots and lots of ingredients you can use to balance a horse's diet. It can get a little complicated, balancing a horse's diet, and I know there's a lot of people that literally lie awake at night worrying about what they're feeding their horse, because it is sometimes really hard to know whether you are actually meeting all your horse's needs. And that is why we have the My Happy Horse virtual equine nutritionist to help you put together balanced diets for your horses. So if you haven't seen that yet, duck on over to myhappy.horse as our website, and you can have a look and see whether using our virtual nutritionist might be a fit for you in putting together your horse's diet. It certainly does make it a lot easier when you can see, first of all, what's missing from your horse's diet, and second, whether what you are feeding is actually filling up those gaps and balancing your horse's diet. So check it out, myhappy.horse. And that brings us to the fifth and final rule of feeding your horse like a horse, and that is to provide constant access to water and salt. And not just any water, it needs to be very clean, fresh water, and salt should always be available. So again, think about a horse evolving. They roamed free everywhere, and there's nearly always salt licks available to animals that have got enough area to range over. And you still see them on large properties or small properties if you happen to have a salty area on a small property, but you'll see where the animals will just congregate around these salty areas and lick the ground to meet their salt requirements. But of course, when we confine horses to paddocks, yards, stables, they don't have that luxury of being able to roam and find fresh water sources and also salt. So we need to provide it to them. So with the salt, you can provide it in a few different ways. My personal preference and the way I provide it for my horses is to have loose rock salt in a container that's not going to corrode, so either a plastic or a rubber container. And I just dip dipperfuls of it in there. I keep it under cover when I can so that if it rains, it doesn't get wet. But even if it does rain and get wet, generally it'll dry back out again, and it's not an issue. You might just need to break it back up again because it will set into quite a hard sort of packed down layer of salt. But that's my preference, is to use loose rock salt. You can provide salt blocks, but just be aware that particularly with the compressed salt blocks, they were typically created for ruminants. So if you've ever been licked by a cow, which is something that has happened to me, I showed a lot of cattle when I was younger, and they would get so friendly, and I loved my cows, and they would often lick me. So I remember quite a few times being licked up the cheek by a cow, and their tongues are rough. They are so rough. which means that when they lick at those compressed salt blocks and the roughness of the tongue helps them get the salt off the block. And it also means too that their tongue doesn't get sore. But if you feel your horse's tongue, it's very, very much like our tongue. And in fact, I think a horse's tongue is probably even softer than a human's tongue. They're incredibly soft. So if you think about that soft tongue licking at a salt block, it's not the most comfortable thing for a horse's tongue to be doing. And you'll usually see, that's why you normally see if you put a salt block out for a horse, they'll normally bite at it with their teeth because they don't like to lick at it because it hurts their tongue. So you can use them, but particularly if you're in a very hot and humid climate where horses do need a lot of salt every day because they sweat so much of it out, you're much better off using loose rock salt. If you really do want to use a block, then I'd consider using, say, the pink Himalayan salt blocks, not because there's anything special about the salt as such, but just because they tend to be smooth, so they can lick sort of a nice smooth surface on them, and it's a little bit softer and kinder to their tongue. So that's salt. And then the rule I want you to remember with water is that if it's not clean enough for you to drink, then it's not clean enough. So it's incredibly important to have very, very clean water. And it's for a few reasons. So if you have got horses that you are wanting to eat to maintain their weight because they're in work or because they are a lactating mare who's also feeding a foal and producing a lot of milk, you want them to have a high water intake because the more they drink, the more they're willing to eat. If you think about as a human, if you're eating, let's say, salty potato chips, which I am a little bit partial to, but you didn't have any water, there's only so long that you'll eat those salty potato chips before you go, you know what, I'm so thirsty that I don't want to eat anymore, and you won't eat anymore until you get a drink. So your horses are in this almost exact situation, except their forage typically isn't salty, but the forage, if they're eating, particularly if they're eating dry hay or dry pasture, it pulls a lot of water into their gastrointestinal tract and makes them very thirsty. So if they don't have fresh water and water that they're really happy to drink, they'll actually reduce their feed intake, and that's not what you want them to do. Anyone listening who has got a fat pony that you would go, I'd really like to reduce my pony's feed intake, I hear you, I get where you're coming from, and this is not how you should do it, because the other reason that you need to make sure that horses have got lots of fresh, clean water is if they don't drink enough and their gut contents dry out, that the gut contents then get stuck and you'll end up with an impaction colic, and you definitely don't want to be dealing with an impaction colic. So we need to always make sure that a horse's water sources are very, very clean so that they're really happy to go and drink it. And it's interesting, I notice with my horses, I'm certainly not perfect on this, but I'm pretty good. I remember when we were studying at university and we were doing dairy nutrition, I distinctly remember Professor Hinch, who was also my PhD supervisor. I'll never ever forget him telling us that if a dairy cow's water is not clean enough for you to drink, then it's not clean enough. And the same rule applies for horses. But it's interesting watching my horses when I go to clean out their trough. They just love when that water is fresh. They'll stand there and drink, and they'll play in it, and it's almost like they have this look of joy on their faces because the trough's just been cleaned out. So they do love, and I can understand, we all love our nice clean water, so they do love when their water's clean. So go and have a look in your trough tomorrow, and if you think to yourself, that you wouldn't drink it, even if you were thirsty, then it's time to find whatever tool you need to pull the bung out of your trough and give it a good scrub and a good clean to make sure that it's nice and clean for your horses. So that brings us to the end of the very first podcast. I really do hope that there is something of value in there for you, and it gives you some perspective, I guess, on some of the most important things to think about when you're feeding horses and why. So just keep thinking about how long they evolve for, and the fact that their gut has been set up so specifically to eat a really high forage diet that is consumed over, the best part of a 24-hour period with very few breaks in between or very few rests where they're not eating something, the more that you can simulate that and honour that for your modern day horses, the healthier their gut will be, the healthier they will be overall, and the happier they will be as well. And you will see it. We all know when our horses are happy, and you will see that when they've got lots of forage to eat, it's available in front of them all the time, and there's also a variety of that forage. They're going to be healthy little creatures, and when you can make sure that diet is also balanced and give them constant access to water and salt, then you'll keep them really very healthy. So the podcast to follow on from this will go into a lot more of the technical details around, refining diets for different types of horses and different disease conditions and all sorts of interesting stuff about feeding horses. And if you've got anything that you would love us to cover, anyone you would love me to interview on the show, then please drop us a line and tell us what you would love to hear. And with that, I will say farewell and I will talk to you soon. Thank you so much for listening and for helping us officially kick off Season 2 2026. If you take nothing else from this episode, take this. Forage drives gut health. And if you truly focus on the forage in your horse's diet, you will be most of the way toward having happy, healthy horses. Here's a tiny action step for today. Pick just one thing to improve in the next 7 days. Maybe weighing your hay, adding one additional fibre type, or adjusting how you feed hay so your horse isn't running out and spending hours at a time without something to chew. Small changes, but big ripple effects. And if you want help checking whether your horse's diet is actually balanced, come and grab the My Happy Horse Nutrition app. It's the virtual equine nutritionist that shows you what's missing from your horse's diet and guides you towards fixing it. You'll find the download link in the show notes. And finally, we'd love you to subscribe so you don't miss the new 2026 episodes. And if you know someone who loves a horse nutrition deep dive as much as you do, please send them this episode. Thanks again, and we will catch you soon.